Hi, I'm Debbie Forster. I'm the CEO of the Tech Talent Charter. Thank you so much for joining us for our first Flexi Festival. Some of you were already with us for our morning coffee, and I'm really pleased that you've joined us for our working lunch. So open up your sandwiches, your soup, whatever you've got. I'm going to keep sipping the caffeine today. Normally, if this was a real life event, I'd be telling you about the exits and the loos and emergencies and all that sort of thing. What I'm going to tell you today is what's happening on your screen. So you are watching us here, but everything you need is on your screen. If you scroll down a little bit, you will see that we want to have a conversation with you. So you will see two tabs. One of those is for Q&A. I've got an amazing panel here. You're going to have some questions and we want to have them. So please type those questions in. We also have polls. I want to try and get the beat of the room and see what's happening. So you can check. There's already a poll there that you can fill in. I'll ask you again at the end of the session to fill in because we want to know how you think the session went. So as we're talking, we're going to refer to the rest of the week. We have morning coffees, we have working luncheons, and we have evening cuppas on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. If you, as you're listening, think, oh my goodness, I haven't signed up for one of those, cursor, just scroll down a bit more. You can still sign up for those sessions. As we talk about things, you will hear us talk about this report. We covered it in depth this morning. We're going to mention it today. If you want to have a copy of that, if you want to look through for yourself, do go down. You'll see in our toolkit where you can download our report for this year, our open playbook that gives you the hows you can go about doing all this, or use our directory. Then if you go down, if you've not joined the Tech Talent Charter, why heavens not? We'd love to have you join. It's free to join. Keep going down on this page and you'll find the details on how to become a signatory. And last but not least, you will see at the bottom of the page, it's free to join the charter, but we have companies that give us sponsorship to make events like this happen. Our overarching sponsor is Unilever, but you will see the sponsors for across the week. So that's enough from me. Let's have a look at the session. If you joined us this morning, what you will have heard is in depth the facts and figures that came out of our report. Where are we with gender? Where are we with ethnicity? But you also heard the beginning of some other discussions. What happened during COVID? Where are we with flexible working? Can we measure culture? Where are we in terms of bringing people with us? Today's session is our chance to dig a bit deeper in that. We'll be hearing from a panel of experts who can talk to us about what is happening in the space. What are other companies doing? If that is of interest to you, then you want to come back again this evening for our evening cuppa, where we will talk to some employers doing this at the coal front of what's really happening in D&I. Enough for me. It's time to hear from our panel. So let me bring in across Edleen John. Edleen John.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Debbie, and hello to everybody here today. I am delighted to be chairing this panel and having this discussion. So I am one of the lucky few who is a director on Tech Talent Charter as one of my roles, but I also work as the International Relations, Corporate Affairs and co-partner for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at the Football Association. But today is not about hearing from me. It is about hearing from our esteemed panelists. So I'm going to ask each of them to give us a quick introduction before us getting into the meat of the discussion today, because I want to make sure that you leave having heard their knowledge, their experience and learnt from their expertise. So with that, if I go to Sheree first to just give us a quick intro.
Yeah, so hi everybody, I am Sheree Atcheson and I am a multi-award winning global diversity, equity and inclusion leader. I am the Global Director of DE&I at Peakon, which is an employee success platform. I'm an advisory board member at Women Who Code, a Forbes contributor and the published author of Demanding More, Why Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Isn't Happening and What You Can Do About It.
Brilliant, thanks Sheree. And over to Emma.
Hi, morning, afternoon, delighted to be here. I'm Emma Stewart. I am co-founder of Timewise. We are a social business and we have been obsessed by flexible working for 15 years. We do a whole range of research, campaign work and quite a lot of work with the government to champion the benefits of flex. But we also go into businesses and provide consultancy and training and help businesses to improve their approach. And we run a jobs board for we have about 100,000 people who want their next job to be a good quality and a flexible one. and employers advertise vacancies with us, because fundamentally we want to make sure we have a fairer, flexible jobs and workplace for all.
Great, thank you, Emma. And Leonie?
Hi, my name is Leonie and I work at the Behavioural Insights team, which is a social purpose company that works primarily with government, but also others as well, to make policy more effective by using insights from behavioural sciences. And the team that I work in works with large employers and labour market gatekeepers to trial and test new interventions to improve equality in the workplace.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Alison.
Hi, I'm Alison Ettridge. I'm CEO and founder and chief believer of Talent Intuition, which is the company behind Strategens. Strategens is a large data platform that joins the dots between skills supply, diversity, real estate, business continuity, flexible working, so that business leaders can make better decisions. We're a really, really proud member of Tech Talent Charter, and I'm delighted to have contributed some data to the report.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Alison. So let's get into the discussion today. And I'm going to kickstart with you, Leonie. There was a time when we think about talking about unconscious bias, there are a suite of organizations rushing out to engage in training employees and thinking that that would be the magic or the silver bullet to solve all the problems around the equality, equity, diversity and inclusion space. But we know that there is no magic bullet. So what has your research shown actually works within organizations?
Yeah, sure. So I could say a little bit about unconscious bias training, if that's helpful. So I feel that when I talk about unconscious bias training, I need to kind of preface it with the fact that unconscious bias is an absolutely well-established scientific fact, just because of the unfortunate politicization of unconscious bias in training in recent months. But when it comes to unconscious bias training, it's probably one of the most well-studied diversity initiatives there is, and across hundreds of studies and several meta-analyses, what we find is that, unfortunately, it's not very effective at changing key long-term important outcomes like representation or behaviours, and in some cases it can backfire. And why might this be? So I think it's helpful to think about unconscious bias training as a little bit like trying to learn a new sport by reading lots of books about it. You're obviously going to improve your knowledge and understanding, but it's not going to be a lot of help when it comes time to playing. And we sort of understand that this whole unconscious level of learning that goes on that's only really achievable through a huge amount of repetition and constant in-the-moment timely feedback. And that's exactly how unconscious biases are formed in the first place, through repetition over years and decades of our lives of certain stereotypical representations in media and other places, as well as the actual representation of certain groups in positions of power. And so we're actually asking quite a lot from this training to unravel all of that. So when it comes to tackling unconscious bias, what are our alternatives? And the alternatives are really looking at our processes and removing the opportunity for biases to take place. So that's, making sure they're more transparent, making sure that there's consistency, making sure you've got accountability. And over time, as those processes act and change and make a difference, representation changes, and that's what's going to change biases in the long term. I think sometimes when I talk about unconscious biases, people feel like it's not changeable, but it is. It's slow, it's through repetition, it's through representation, which is why it's only possible to tackle through kind of key processes.
So Leonie, to, I suppose, add or expand to what you've said, in essence, you've said that the unconscious bias training often acts as that first moment of awareness and an educational piece, but actually some of those biases are challenged through experience, ongoing learning, ongoing inclusion nudges, and continued awareness so that people transform their behaviour within an organisation. Would that be a fair summary? Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely. Do any of our other leaders have any thoughts around unconscious bias training?
Yeah, I mean, at Peakon, our work is ultimately in the inclusion nudges, like you've mentioned. And what we found, interestingly, in our data sets, we have the world's largest standardized data set around inclusion because of all of the different people using our platform. And what we found was actually an increase in comments around racial and ethnicity inclusion after the murder of George Floyd last year. But what we also found was actually 1 in 10 of those comments were from non-minority folks, so white women and white men, voicing resistance to change. And that's exactly what we've just heard from Leonie here. We see that this is a nudge, but it has to be a consistent nudge with process change, because in the background, people are still thinking the same, and our data is certainly showing that. What's important now is how we hold accountability with this moving forward.
And Sheree, you've touched on a really important point there around data, which I know was covered earlier on in this morning's session, talking about the importance of data in this space. And of course, Peakon as an organisation do a lot of work looking at inclusion and employee engagement. So Sheree, do you mind just sharing with us a little bit about the specifics on what it is Peakon are finding through their data analysis, through the work that they're doing with that broad breadth of insights that they're gaining across the globe?
Yeah, of course. Data is incredibly important to us. It's what we do. And what we're able to find is inclusion data and inclusion metrics. Very often people feel like you can't measure culture, and you can. You can measure whether people feel, certainly from different backgrounds, if they feel different around, you know, an organization's approach to diversity, inclusiveness, and non-discrimination, for example. And what we're able to see in our data is that uptick in increase. In our employee engagements report last year, we saw a significant increase in employees demanding more from their organizations on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're about to share our next employee engagement report. And again, we're seeing more increases in this space. So what that's telling us is that this work must be strategic. It must be long-term. It must not just be a quick fix or putting a sticky plaster on a gaping wound. You can't do that. And employees are asking for more. And what we're also seeing from the resistance piece is that we have to be very clear on, one, what we expect of employees, how inclusion must be integrated in through your values and your company DNA. But also, if people aren't willing to get involved with that, you have to be able to have a conversation around that and be able to determine, you know, is this a place for people like that, or is it not? And that's certainly what we're seeing, that accountability and the long-term longevity of DE&I is coming to the forefront more and more.
Great, thank you, Sheree. Just a brief reminder to encourage you to add questions, as Debbie mentioned at the beginning, but I just want to continue to build on what Sheree said there, and would like to just go to Alison next and just ask the question. Alison, I suppose as a leader of a business, what are your views on that accountability point that Sheree mentioned, and how do you embed that within an organization and within the practices that we're talking about here?
Yeah, so I feel quite strongly that actually you can make this a data-led conversation, and if it's a data-led conversation, then actually you can have conversations about accountability in a very different way. You can demystify some of the processes by talking to people about what's really happening, whether that is internal data around inclusion and some of the great data that you can get out of platforms like Peakon, or whether that's external data and holding a mirror up to yourself. And I think there's something about, as a leader, saying, you know, culture is pervasive, so it doesn't really matter where diversity sits. But the right people have got to be listening, and that comes from building accountability, and that comes from making it a data-led conversation, I think.
You made a really interesting point there, Alison, that I just want to touch on. You said it doesn't really matter where diversity sits. That others have different views on the importance of where diversity sits. Leonie, I'd like to come to you for a moment.
In terms of where it sits in the organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. And where it sits in terms of prioritisation on the agenda of a business. Yeah,
absolutely. So I think what's really interesting is that there's really good evidence around appointing, say, diversity managers or task forces to improve accountability. However, it's really important that that's implemented in the right way. So in particular, they need to be in a position of senior position where they have influence over other people. They need to have resources in order to do the thorough work. They need to have access to data, and they need to be able to interrogate people's decisions. That's how you really make sure that that's about accountability. And so I think I suppose in terms of where that sits, it needs to be a key priority of the senior leadership overall. And then also making sure that it's not therefore designated to, say, a small number of individuals, a small number of individuals, and therefore it's kind of seen as a separate issue that sort of HR or one person looks after. But by having, really prioritized funding, etc., for that work, and allowing that person to be in all different spaces and having them be part of the broader fabric of the company, then you create real accountability.
Great, fantastic. So the importance of accountability and making sure that organisational support is there and is at the forefront of everyone's mind is critical as it relates to moving this agenda forward. Emma, I'd like to just come to you for a moment to talk a little bit about the current environment that we're operating within. So I think it's fair to say over the past 12 to 18 months, we've all changed the ways in which we have worked. So if I think back over the course of my career, flexible working and the importance of flexible working and what that meant was very, very different compared to the backdrop within which we've operated against now. My first question is, do you think that we are working in a flexible way at the moment? And actually, what does flexible working really, really mean?
Good question. I think we are all working remotely, which is one form of flexible working. And I think businesses and organisations have managed to adapt incredibly well. But I think we need to remember that for many, this has been forced on them. We've had a lot of very good examples of flexible working for many, many years. But what we're doing now is a sort of enforced remote working. What we would say at Timewise in terms of how do we define flexible working, put simply, it's anything that's different to what you expect to be standard, and the rules have changed. But it's how much people work, where people work, which is what we're thinking about now in the context of hybrid working, and when people work. And whilst we've seen a huge shift in terms of remote working, I mean, permanent remote working was around sort of 4 or 5% before the crisis. It's now about sort of 50 to 60%. What we've not seen so much of is a shift in thinking around other forms of flexible working. And a couple of watch-outs, really. You know, part-time really matters, and particularly in the context of the ED&I agenda, we all know the data that's showing that women are really struggling disproportionately in relation to homeschooling, in relation to managing work and care, in relation to not being able to get furlough. Coming out the other side of this, if we think about well-being for women and men, we need to be thinking about how we can redesign jobs to be part-time. And the other thing is we need to be thinking about when people work. So we have a risk, if we're not careful, that we're going to end up with a bit of a two-tier labour market, where those that can take a laptop and work from home do. Those who work outside of the home, approximately 50% of the workforce, whether they're nurses, teachers, care workers, construction site workers, can't. And so what they need is input into how they work at what points of the day, which is very much thinking about kind of flex, sort of shift-based working, and being able to have some control and input, so that they can pre-plan their lives alongside their work. So we've come a huge way, but I think we've got to be careful that remote is just one form of flex. And actually, you know, if we want to look ahead in terms of where next, we've got to be thinking about how can we turn what we've learned into something that's really sustainable and really inclusive. And that will require a lot more thought in relation to how we equip managers with the skills and the capabilities, as well as the accountabilities, to manage diverse and hybrid teams.
Thanks, Emma. Alison, I know you've got some points to add to what we've shared already, so it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I love what Emma has been saying and talking about. And it's really interesting because it ties into this time last year, in fact, January last year, we put forward a report called The New Ecosystem of Work, which had this whole bunch of factors that we believe impact on managing the supply of skills in an organisation. And what COVID did was accelerate that. But actually, one of the key points that came out of this was that we believe we need to, as organisations, to move to a space where we're taking a role and we're breaking that role down into different tasks rather than kind of bundling them all into one job title. And when you do that, it's interesting because you can then say, where is this task best done? And is there a time at which it's best done? And when you start to break a role down like that, actually, it really enables flexible working in a much broader way, as Emma and Timewise allude to.
Great. And Leonie, I suppose you will have had some research and behavioural insights potentially around this area. So keen to get your thoughts as well.
Yeah, great. And I'm really happy to hear Emma talking about the distinguishing between remote working and part-time working when we talk about flexible working. Really important point to make. And I think when it comes to remote working in terms of how we're coming out of that and the restrictions are lifted, we've been doing some really interesting work on, is it possible that this is going to create who's in the room versus who's not in the room? And there is some evidence to suggest that we've been finding that senior leaders may be more likely to spend more time in the office as we come out of restrictions. And so what we're worried about is that will create a strong commitment signal that if your senior leaders are coming into the office more, that therefore people who are more committed to their work come into the office more. And that's one of the key issues with part-time work at the moment, and the reason why we see so many penalties there. And we've also done some experimental work, which is soon to be published, that's actually looked at how remote working policy is communicated to employees and whether there's a way to better frame it so you do encourage genuine choice. We know that choices around this are affected by what your line manager is doing, what you think others are doing, what you think your senior leaders are doing, etc. So, and we've been finding some really interesting stuff there that shows if organizations communicate remote working policy in some ways that are quite typical, that could lead to unequal uptake.
So a question to build on that, and this is one I want to throw open to the room. Is it about policy? Is it about processes? Or is it about organizational culture?
Can I?
Oh, I'll go. Yeah, go. Whoever wants to go for it. Everybody's hand went up there. Wonderful. Go for it, Emma.
I'd say it's a bit of everything, Edleen. But crucially, what I would say is we've really got to be thinking beyond just policies here. And I mean, we've done a lot of work with organisations over the years around how you can drive the change you want to see in the context of having a really kind of fair and inclusive and consistent, importantly, approach to flexibility. And to enable people to have that kind of input and control into how they work. And what we have seen is at a cultural level, it's really important to make sure that we have open and honest conversations, and as opposed to non-conversations when it comes to flexibility. So from leaders walking the talk through to being able to encourage managers, as Leonie was saying, to articulate that the organisation is open to this, because there's a big difference between saying you can work flexibly here and saying you can work flexibly here and you won't be penalised in terms of progression or missed opportunity. And that's where we really want to get to. And the other point I'd really want to reinforce is the skills piece, which is we don't train managers in how to manage flexible teams or in the concept of job design, which Alison sort of referenced. And it's really, really important that, if we're asking our managers to manage people in really, really different ways and to think about task-based and output-based activity, we've got to give them support in that. We've got to help them to understand how to redesign jobs differently. There's reasons why when people go part-time, jobs don't get redesigned and then they leave, because you end up working 5 days a week for a 4-day-a-week salary because the manager and the individual hasn't had that very honest and open conversation about where the work goes. So there are policies matter when it comes to formal flex, but we are all working informally flexibly, and we need that leadership, that culture shift to go from reactive to being really proactive in having those conversations. And just one more thing, we did some research with the CMI a couple of years ago, found that only 1 in 5 managers had ever had a proactive conversation at a performance review about how people were working. So the onus has always been on the individual. We need to start shifting that now, because businesses recognise that people are going to be working differently for a long time to come, and so we need to be investing and supporting them to know how to do that better.
And to build on that, do you think that those conversations haven't historically happened through fear of people not knowing what to say or knowing how to say the right thing, or through not wanting to make an offer of an option that they can't uphold? What do we think has been holding back those conversations and the transition from organisational perspectives to really embrace flexible working in the broadest sense? Alison, I want to come to you on that one to get your thoughts.
Oh, blimey. So I think it's a bigger conversation actually than policy or process, and has this been a challenge because managers haven't felt that they can have the conversation? I think what's happening, if we look at the macro environment, if you look at COVID, if you look at future of work, all of those things mean that senior leaders are having to think, as Emma said, skills first. And therefore, this is fundamentally about organisation redesign and about job redesign. And I think that macro environment has enabled leaders to have the conversation that perhaps wasn't as high up the agenda as it should have been 12 months ago or 24 months ago.
Thank you. Sheree, your organisation focuses a lot on employee engagement. The data that you have access to or that you're seeing through Peakon, is flexible working, or indeed the fact that we're all working remotely now, having an impact on that level of employee engagement? And what can employers do to begin to think specifically around the inclusion elements that will come through a lack of employee engagement?
Yeah, we've seen all of the things you're talking about. Certainly last year at the start of the year, we saw an increase in people asking for remote work support, a statistical increase in that, and likewise also a statistical increase when it came to mental health support, due to the pandemic, due to the shifts in working, but not the roles shifting in the way they needed to. What we also seen was actually all of those things increase, but what we did see decrease was growth opportunities. So to very clearly answer to the other things that have been said, that roles are moving into different realms, people are doing things in different ways, but the expectations of delivery haven't changed enough. The growth opportunities piece on how you allocate a growth opportunity, how you decide who gets what over whatever reason, hasn't progressed enough to be inclusive, because we're still relying too much on biases and on personal relationships and on affinity bias, for example, to really decide who gets those opportunities. And what we can see is that we need to make sure that we are really deliberate. And this is what we talk about when we're talking about inclusion. We're talking about deliberate action, talking about purposeful action. And that's the same question and the same answer, when it comes to supporting people who are working in different ways. There has to be deliberate action to make sure we are supporting those people. It isn't good enough to just, allow people to work in the way that suits them. It's also, the connection of that, what happens next. And we can see people demanding and asking more of their employers in that space. And we've seen the use of our platform through all of the companies that use us, increasing, that people are using the platform to share more, to have their voice heard, and to be involved in the conversation in a way that's psychologically safe. What we need is employers to make sure that they are listening and moving from listening into action.
So talking about that moving into action piece specifically, I suppose, how much influence do leaders have in making sure that initiatives are actually taking place and are being acted upon? We all are aware of, a suite of organizations over the course of the year who had listening groups post the activities or the events as it relates to George Floyd, who had groups to understand and hear from their broader workforce, and then actually subsequent action has been limited. So what is the responsibility for leaders to decide on what initiatives they need to act on? And in this current environment where people are at home, you maybe aren't getting some of those water cooler or coffee chats, how can you actually prioritize what activities need to come first in the current work environment and then in the subsequent future work environment? I'll go to Leonie first on this one.
Yeah, really, really important question. And so I think this is all about how do your organizations work really carefully to identify exactly what's going to work in their own context. And this is about senior leaders prioritizing this work. So that involves having better data. By better data, I mean all of the additional characteristics that we were talking about this morning beyond gender, but also having really, really detailed data on every single part of all of your different processes that are leading to key outcomes. So looking at your pay, bonus, reward, progression, every single part of that. Did you record who applied for progression, as well as what happened in the promotions round, etc. And so when you have all of that data, then what you need to do is do careful analysis of that data. So I think this is something where we've got to start where people are, but we want to get more and more sophisticated with this so we can really isolate the individual impact of different factors in outcomes. And then from there, that's where you get your priorities. You can see where your biggest differences are and your biggest problems are, and then those dictate your priorities. And then the next step is taking a really people-centered approach to designing those solutions. Get under the skin of a particular process where you're finding an issue. What is actually happening on the ground? So for example, you might think you have structured interviews, but when you go and see what's going on, they're not structured at all. And why is that happening? Often it's not because people have particularly strong opinions about structured interviews or not. It can be really simple things like the guidance to structured interviews is an obscure intranet page and no one ever mentioned it to me and I've never been trained in it. It could be things like no one ever asked me to provide the structured interview scores, which is a form of social accountability. And so it's identifying all of those, seeing where particular norms are. I love the conversation earlier about the gap between policy and practice, and that's a lot of our work is working in that space. We think we have a particular policy, but we need to understand what is actually driving behaviour on the ground and taking a really people-centred approach to that. And then when you have an intervention, that you need to test and evaluate it. Don't assume that something is going to work for you just because it's worked elsewhere. It's really important that you actually measure the effects of it and you're really, really patient with that approach. You may not see the impact of something immediately. Most of the trials that we run have to run for several months before we can be confident in the result of it. So all of these activities, data, people-centered, testing, evaluating, these all take time, patience, and primarily funding. And that's where senior leaders coming in to make sure that that work, really, really careful work, is being prioritized.
Thanks, Leonie. Emma, I'm keen to hear from you around priorities.
Yes, keen to tell you what we're seeing. I mean, so my kind of pragmatic response to that is what we're seeing in the market at the moment. So we're advising a broad range of firms, and what we're seeing ExCos really having to face into very fast is how we're returning to offices. And I think there's an opportunity here to leverage what are kind of commercial considerations and really hardwire them into the ED&I agenda, because we know millions of people want to retain some form of flexibility. We know businesses are having to now that we have a way out of lockdown work out whether, how, if they bring people back into offices and how they balance office and home working. And I think there's a huge opportunity there, because that is absolutely a priority for many businesses right now. Do we do 3 days? Do we do 2 days? What do we do? It's a whole kind of conversation around hybrid that we're doing a lot of work in, advising firms on. So I would say we should leverage what we are seeing in the market as being a priority. And the other point I would make, which is more about what we're seeing, not necessarily the kind of wider, I guess, kind of thesis around it, but is we have seen over the course of this year, everybody change how they work. What has shifted in working practices hasn't necessarily translated into hiring practices. And one of the things that we recognise is that business leaders still see talent and skills as hugely high on the agenda. There are firms that are still going to be struggling to get the best possible talent. We want them to be as diverse as possible in their approach. And yet, even though we've been through COVID, we still only have 2 out of 10 job vacancies in the UK referencing flexible working from day one. So we would urge, as well as what we're seeing, businesses to recognise that actually talking about flexibility at the point of hire is going to be a crucial priority, because people are going to expect it. And if you want good talent in this new world we're in, we have to be articulating that really carefully. And I know Behavioural Insights team did some really interesting work with Zurich to show the uplift of women's applications and hires in the context of doing that. We've been doing a lot of work on that for years. But thinking about the hire piece and how we can ensure we attract diverse talent as well as retain it is going to be key.
And I'd like to come to Alison next to get some insights and thoughts on this.
Oh, I love what Emma is saying. We do a lot of work with businesses around workforce and workplace and how those two things gel. And I think when I talked earlier about it doesn't matter where diversity sits as a function or EDI sits as a function, I think what we mean by that is you've got to join the dots. D&I should be in every conversation and across every function. And when it is treated in that way, so you're looking through a workforce, workplace, real estate, skills supply lens, actually you can use data to inform a conversation and have actually some really big impacts in areas that we probably couldn't have had the same conversation 18 months ago. So I think Emma's talked about the opportunity. I think there's a huge opportunity for companies, whether they're big or small, to genuinely think differently and turn the dial about the supply of skills and the makeup of those skills in their organizations.
And Alison, I just want to pick beneath the skin of that just a little bit to try and understand how is it that employers can use that data to drive their D&I work forward? So how, I think we've all been in situations where you have an abundance of data, you get representation information or you get recruitment information, but how do you actually use that data to drive the change that we want to see across organizations?
So clearly I'm biased. I'll talk about our data, but I think what's interesting is that it's much easier to use external data than it is to use internal data. So when you start thinking about external data, if I look at Strategens, which is our platform, we launched Strategens because we knew that businesses were struggling with the supply of skills globally. So that was our raison d'etre, so that organizations could understand where skills were. To put that into context, there are 350 million profiles globally that inform Strategens, and those are broken down by location, by skills, and by then gender and ethnicity. So if you think about the external environment, then you can genuinely start to hold a mirror up to your internal data. So if you're looking and saying, across our data engineering team in Cardiff, we have a 10% representation of females. How does that compare to the external market? If the external market says, actually, there's the opportunity for you to grow that, then you can tactically turn the dial by advertising, by thinking differently, by being proactive in that area. But actually, if the external data set shows that you're doing the best that you can do, it's going to be a longer term play. So there's this element of saying, don't set yourself a really high target or high goal because it sounds good and it's a marketing exercise. Think about it. Think about the skills. Think about your locations. Think about your workforce and your workplace and how that you could break the roles down. And then use data to understand how quickly you can turn a dial. Because that's the point at which you can start to drive accountability with your line managers and not just a policy or a process. I feel so passionately about it.
Great, thank you, Alison. And I'm keen to go to Sheree next, because of course a lot of the work that Peakon do focuses on this data, and actually I know obviously a lot of the work is also global, so you're getting insights not just on that local level but more broadly globally. It'd be great if you could just tell us a bit more about that and how you use that to, again, dig underneath what's happening within organizations to drive that action.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the key thing here is the understanding of inclusion from different perspectives. So what we're able to do, we have a tool that allows people to capture that special category, protected characteristic data in a GDPR compliant way. Using one tool, you can ask the different questions you want to ask based on regions, so you don't have to take a blanket approach, which you can't do in lots of regions. But also what's important and useful from our perspective is our benchmarks. So given the amount of organizations using us, from big enterprise customers to smaller companies and everything in between, we were able to create a benchmark which helps people understand in relation to their industry how they were doing in terms of diversity, equity and inclusion and engagement. Now, what we are able to do with that is you're able to easily understand, actually, whereabouts am I in the grand scheme of things? What am I doing? What am I not doing? And what do I need to do? What we also do is actually provide benchmarking based on your internal organization, which is incredibly important when you're in an organization that's substantial and substantially has a big head count. How are you actually doing in terms of the overall organization as well? So you can start to have these conversations, have the nuance and have the understanding of what's working well, how do I replicate that, and how do I measure if it's still working, and two, what's not working and how do I make sure I pivot into something that makes sense. Using the data that we have allows people to really have that temperature check on diversity, equity and inclusion across management support, loyalty, growth opportunities, non-discrimination, inclusiveness, belonging, all of the things that people are trying to talk about and not being able to measure, but actually you can measure it, and we've been doing it successfully for a long time, and we're able to help people really elevate. And I always describe the work that we do as we elevate diversity, equity and inclusion and engagement strategies. We provide you the insights to make change happen, and we're able to give you those benchmarks as well, so you can see, actually, are you doing well, and do you need to do more, and do you need to do it better?
And Sheree, you've given a lot of really good points there around the importance of data and how it can enable you to flex your approach through working through the information coming in, adapting as you move along. But I want to go to Alison and just find out a bit more about the usage of data, but also a key critical point for me is, how do we avoid using data in a way that is tokenistic? So again, we will have all been in organizations or had discussions where people will say, oh, did X person only get promoted because they are female and they were trying to hit a target? Or was this person only given that client opportunity because they're a parent? How do we avoid situations where data becomes the excuse for not driving this agenda forward, and actually tokenism becomes the rationale given as to why people don't want to focus on data? So Alison, I want to go to you there. We've got 5 more questions, 5 more minutes until the Q&A, so please do send in your questions if you haven't, and please do the poll, which is on the second tab. But to give you a little bit more time to think, I'm just going to go to Alison.
Thanks. I wanted I agree completely with everything that Sheree was saying, and the ability for an organisation to benchmark themselves against their external and against their industry is fantastic, and we support that wherever you can. I think the balance of internal and external data is really interesting, and you can use some external data to be tactical, and I think there is a danger that when you challenge your internal data, you can make it an excuse, because if you're asking your internal data, tell me this, you're already asking the question in a way that is biased, and therefore the data could give you a biased response. But actually, when you scale that up, you have 350 million profiles sitting behind Strategens, you scale that up and you start to ask some big questions. Yeah, sometimes it can be used as an excuse. If there genuinely isn't a population that can help you turn the dial right now, let's not beat people over the head of it and say, well, why aren't you doing something? Let's give them the tools that are going to enable them to make the change in the longer term. But likewise, and this is what we hear more often, is actually the data challenges internal opinions. The data can say, this is what you can do. And therefore it doesn't become an excuse. It becomes a conversation and helps to change mindsets. And I think that's the most important piece that we can do in this, is help to change the mindsets of the people who can turn the dial.
And so if we had to drill down to 3 or 4 key KPIs that each organisation should think about looking at or investing time in obtaining information on, what would this group suggest might be those 3 or 4 key KPIs that we should be looking at? I'll go to Leonie first.
Well, from my perspective, it should depend on your own organisation and where their key issues lie. So obviously at the very, very top level, we're looking at things like pay gaps and senior representation. But then, there are so many different things that will be driving those. And you want to have more specific KPIs within that. Otherwise, it's going to be quite demotivating when you're looking at those really, really high level stats. So it may be that in your organization, there is something going on in your promotions process that is driving your pay gap. It might be something going on with your part-time workers that's driving your pay gap. And so what you'll want to be doing is looking at specifically, what part of the process is driving your issues, and focus your attention and your KPIs there.
Does anybody want to add to that?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, can I just so just building on Leonie's point, I mean, as you'd expect, I'll be very specific in the context of the sort of structural stuff, but when we work with clients, we come in often on the D&I agenda, and we see them doing wellbeing surveys, and we see them doing surveys around kind of various different elements in relation to D&I. What we urge and always ask is, are you looking at data about part-time flexible working? Because often the structural barriers for people are what often drive some of those inequalities. And and this sits across the kind of issue for gender. It's about age. It's about looking at health and well-being issues more broadly. And some very simple metrics is, there's obviously a big debate at the moment as to whether we should legislate to offer flexible working from day one. We're really keen that organisations just start tracking how many people they hire on a formal part-time or flexible basis, as distinct from how many jobs they advertise. We also want to see people hired. and then also how many part-timers progress in the context of full-timers that progress, because there are some really basic bits of insight that you can gain from that, and it helps business leaders to drill down into the details. So one firm we worked with recently realized that they did have a gender progression gap. It was a part-time pay penalty issue, but actually one of the things they hadn't done was they hadn't readjusted their performance metrics for part-timers. So they weren't measuring them on 3/5 or 4/5. They were still measuring them on 5/5 of the output. So of course they weren't going to perform as well, so therefore they were overlooked for promotion. So just to add, I think once you define some of these things, it really helps to draw out other insights that are really useful in how you rethink and address some of these issues at a kind of framework level.
And so I think to add to that and talk about the piece that we've just been talking about on flexible working, how is it that employers can really look at ensuring that staff have a suitable and safe environment as we move into a place where remote working may become more standard practice across the board, given the backdrop of COVID and where we are at the moment? Who wants to take? Sheree?
I'll take it. Yeah.
That one.
Yeah, sure. And I think what we have to remember is that safety isn't just physical safety, etc., but actually also the psychological safety piece as well. And how are you ensuring that people have a voice, have an ability to communicate, etc., in a way that is safe for them? We know, we touched on it already. We don't have water cooler moments anymore. We don't knock into someone going in the lift to the office in the morning. And we have to make sure that we are being really deliberate about how we interact with each other, but how we ensure that people from all different backgrounds are able to interact. When it comes to actual safe working environments and so on, we know that organizations have a balancing act at the moment, especially around the opening and closing of offices for some people that do want to come in from health and well-being perspectives to the government guidelines in many cases where we can't open offices. But organizations also have a responsibility to be able to support people at home, and that may mean through financial means around, desks, the physical piece, the broadband piece, and all of that different kind of stuff. We have to remember the privileges that some of us have that are able to just, when on March last year, we were able to just go home or stay home and open up our laptop. Not everybody was quite so privileged, and quite a lot of organizations had to rush in processes around people being able to, get reimbursed for all of those different kinds of things. But what I don't want people to forget is the psychologically safe piece and the online communication piece, remembering that if microaggressions and macroaggressions and biases exist already, and they do, they will still exist, even though we are not in the same space. And we have to be very deliberate about how we challenge that and hold that to account now that we're all in our living rooms or in our offices.
And so building on that, how do we support managers specifically with the training or the skills to manage not only the current environment, circumstances, and frankly, where we might be going forward, but also to make sure that they are managing diverse talent in a way that meets their needs within and against that backdrop that we're currently operating against? Who wants to go on this one? Alison.
So I want to follow on from Sheree, and that sort of builds into an answer for this, but it's not really an answer. But I think what Sheree is saying is we are in danger of making an assumption that remote working or part-time or flexi working works in all cases, and it doesn't. It's very individual. And Sheree was talking about that, particularly in terms of family circumstances, but also if we're talking about, particularly some of the organizations that we work with, as do other members of the panel, they're global organizations. And there are cultural differences and aspects that need to be allowed for in every single region of the globe, where flexible working from home, working remotely actually is a massive cultural shift. And so all of the learning and development and training that needs to be focused for the leaders and managers needs to be about if that culture needs shifting, and then how do you do it if it does need shifting. I'm sure others will have better answers than that, but that's my best attempt.
No, that's a good start, Alison. I'm going to go to Leonie next to build on that.
Yeah, great. So I think when it comes to thinking about the training that managers need, firstly, I think training should always be really, really specific and contextualized as far as possible. So For example, if we think about diversity training, which has poor evidence for it, that's partly because it's kind of really general and it's disconnected from what's going on the ground. And so really what we should be doing is kind of incorporating aspects of diversity training into core training. So core training that you might need to do before you start doing recruitment or before you become a line manager and start managing someone. And then in terms of the key aspects there, I think it's really important to make sure that it's got an engagement focus rather than a compliance focus. So we find that mandatory training, for example, backfires for that reason. Whereas approaches to this where you're essentially positioning the manager in particular as part of the solution or how they can help solve the problem, you're much more likely to get engagement and change behaviors there. And I think what's really important as well, we were talking a bit earlier about mindsets, when you take this kind of engagement approach, what you have is a situation where you create kind of cognitive dissonance, as they call it in psychology, where if actions and if beliefs and behavior don't match up, we try to consolidate them or make them work together. And actually what happens is when you start changing people's behaviors, you make them, engage them to find ways to improve diversity. So you take an engagement approach to that rather than a compliance one, then they start to see themselves as diversity champions. And that actually sort of in a backwards effect has a much bigger impact on mindset. So when it comes to managing diversity, an engagement approach is really, really important. And then it's all about having teaching methods for having psychologically safe conversations, as Sheree mentioned before. And that's going to be really, really critical for managing the daily kinds of conversations around diversity issues.
And talking about some of those daily conversations around diversity issues and having data-led conversations, one of the things that organizations, depending on their size or depending on the infrastructure they have, might struggle with is how to go about getting that right data to have a data-led conversation. So, if we think historically, context and information within the EDI space continues to evolve. 20 years ago, BAME potentially was a acceptable mechanism by which people were categorized. And actually now we've seen the dialogue societally shift away from that being appropriate, but organizations may have already set up their data collection mechanisms to abide by what was happening previously. So how can organizations think about making that transition, making that change, and getting the right data to enable those data-led conversations?
To be very frank, you change it. If you're capturing ethnicity data and grouping it in a way that is assuming everyone that are not white have the same issues, then you change it, and you change it now. There is no other way around it, to be very honest. You have to change it, and you have to go on the journey with your organization of talking about why you're changing it, how you're recognizing that you're not getting the insights that you need. We just seen that, I'm writing a Forbes piece at the minute, we just seen the ONS data being released for unemployment rates yesterday across ethnicity, nationality, disability, and so on. And we are seeing, for example, that Pakistani women and Black women statistically have 3 times higher the likelihood of unemployment than their white counterparts. So in what world would it make sense for you to group those people together? Now, what we need to do is organizations need to go on a journey. Now, when a lot of my work, and certainly when I'm consulting with organizations, is remembering that this is a journey. You won't just roll out a new category or a new viewpoint of fields overnight. What you should do is start to talk about why this is important. Recognize that the fields or the areas of data collection that you've done in the past is no longer fit for purpose, and then be clear about what you're doing with it, how you're going to use it, how it will fuel the strategy, and it should fuel the strategy. It should underpin it entirely, and be clear on what it means going forward. One of the things that you don't want to do is just roll out data collection and then nobody hears from you again. What we need is this regular transparency piece. Again, that embeds accountability, but around the BAME piece specifically, and when you group together even the LGBT plus community and so on, you're not actually getting data that's really, really meaningful. You're getting a blanket approach, and people do not exist in a blanket society.
That's really helpful, Sheree. I'm conscious of time, so I want to do a quick kind of summary of some of the things you've just focused on and touched on there that we don't have time for before we run to Alison. And then I'm going to ask each of you to summarize in kind of 2 sentences your key takeaway or key piece of advice that you'd give here. But you touched on the importance of intersectionality and the importance of recognizing that data is sometimes going to be different for people who have a number of different underrepresented characteristics, and that experience is going to be different. So let's not bunch and group together. You talked about the importance of the journey and actually people not just arriving at an endpoint without having taken an organization through those discussions, those engagement conversations, and actually cultural change is a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. But you've also talked about the urgency and the need for change. And one of my frustrations as a D&I consultant and having worked in this space for a while is we forever talk about the fact that it is a marathon and not a sprint. But I've also seen that used as an excuse in organizations who don't want to drive things forward. So I keep saying it is a marathon, but we probably need to get at some Paula Ratcliffe speed as opposed to Edleen John speed. So that's one thing I think is quite critical to say. Alison, I'll hand over to you very quickly before doing a quick wrap up and then handing back to Debbie. So go, Alison.
So I'll make mine the wrap up as well. So for me, there is a way of making it a marathon and a sprint. And the how do we do this is the important question there. And I think it's a lot easier when you look at external data because it's anonymized and it's aggregated, and you're not expecting individuals to be part of it. So it becomes a data-led conversation.
Fantastic. So 1 sentence from each of you around the key takeaway. Leonie, I'll go to you first.
Sure. So I think in order to design interventions that work for your organization, you need to have better, granular, clear data. You need to analyze it in a sophisticated way to identify where your problems are, and then take a people-centered approach to really get under the skin of your processes and see what's happening on the ground, and then try it, evaluate it, and if it doesn't work, move on to something else. And all of the interventions that you might want to try should be aiming to increase transparency, accountability, and consistency.
Fantastic. Alison, I'm going to take your previous one as your wrap up. Emma, 1 sentence.
1 sentence. I think we've got a huge opportunity to rethink how we work to make sure we stop excluding people from accessing the jobs market, progressing in work, and being able to balance work with life. I think we need to ensure that we don't waste it. So absolutely everything in relation to data and evaluation, but let's just start testing some things now, because the worry is we'll go back to the way things were if we don't.
Right. And 1 sentence from you, Sheree.
Yeah, what I would say to people is be purposeful, be deliberate about what you're doing, and remember that you have to be accountable for all of this. It can't fall to the wayside, and if it does fall to the wayside, you have to be ready to pick it up and move fast, because we don't have time to keep doing what has been happening in the past.
Brilliant, fantastic. A huge thank you to the panelists, and with that, I would like to hand back to Debbie.
Very much. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Edleen. And listen, thank you for cramming so much information in a short session. We're nearly out of time. I've got 3 minutes. So to remind you, everyone, please look down below this screen. We have a few things we want to do. 1, there was a poll. I'd like to get a sense in that discussion today of people and culture and training versus the accountability, the data, the processes. Where are you prioritizing for 2021? Please put that into the poll. We'll be sharing the results on Friday. We hope we can join us there. This afternoon, if you're interested in hearing what all of these people have been talking, there's been some great consistency in what we heard this morning, what we're hearing today at lunch. If you want to hear what companies are doing on the ground, join us for the evening cuppa, where you will hear about employers and how they're taking what you've heard today and putting it to work in their workplace. Then I want you to look down below. You will also have showing up in the Q&A window. It's important for us to understand what's working and what's not. Please, I am a terrible person for filling out end of event surveys. Be better than I am. Will you please fill in the survey? Tell us what worked, tell us what didn't work, so we can finish and make and vet that better across the week. And then the last thing. If you haven't joined the charter, we want you to join the charter. Have a look below. It's free. We'd love to have you on the journey. But more than anything, whether you join, whether you don't join, think about how you're going to move things forward today in your company. You've heard dozens of insights, dozens of things you can do, whether you're a big multinational or a tiny startup. We have the playbook that can help you. We have the report that can give you that data and give you, remember, those outside data sets to challenge your thinking. Where can I get ahead or behind? But it is a time for tough conversations. It is the time for meaningful action. Thank you for joining us for our working lunch. I hope I get to see you across the week. Tomorrow, we're looking at ethnicity and social mobility. Friday, we're looking at those alternate routes into tech. We want to keep the conversation, tough or otherwise, going on with you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.